Hello. Michelle, how are you?
Actually, Rob, going forward, I've been
Yes,
attending whenever I can, but this is an analog working group, and right?
that is correct.
And so, um, what are you looking for from Open Road as a SoC integration backplane, or I mean, how do you want Open Road project and team members to participate in? Because this seems, very analog focused. Uh,
That is correct. It is an analog focused work group. What I have seen, at least in my experience, but I'd like to have like Mirjana comment, or if Thomas from Infineon can join us too. But that increasingly the crossover between analog and digital design, or methodology from digital, is creeping into the analog space.
right.
And so, I think at least what I was seeing in my waning days at Oracle, if you will,
Mhm.
was that in particular, like the SRAM design, the more that could be done in a digital fashion or digital type methodology, the sooner the design task could be completed. Similar for SerDes. Uh,
For sure.
so I think, certainly there's portions of methodology that could be used or incorporated with Open Road. Now, whether that requires participation of of your time, because I know your time is extremely
Well,
valuable.
no, that was just wanting to know how to help best. Really,
Oh,
that's the
I
time is not an issue.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
In part, that's what I wanted to discuss today, and I guess we might as well get started. It is 5 after the hour, but was to I know we've had two different presentations, one from Michigan and
David.
the other one for David from UT Austin, right? And what I wanted to do was to try to see if we could kind of outline
Mhm.
a roadmap straw man, or effectively a soft roadmap. And I
Mhm.
kind of broke that, so we've had two great university presentations, but I kind of wanted to see if we could, look at where we want to try to go. And some of this was related to the questions, Andrew, that you raised last week. And I also want to start by saying I apologize for the meeting today being a bit off cadence relative to what we've been trying to do. I have a conflict next Tuesday myself,
Mhm.
which is for a CHIPS Alliance presentation that I have to help host. So I apologize for that.
Mhm. Well,
But what I'd like to see is to try to see if we could get some input from the industry members, such as Infineon, Western Digital, Intel, or Google, about some of the analog design challenges that they have, or mixed signal design, right? And really how they can be more productive. Uh, what needs to be done in that arena. And some of that's design methodology, some of that's EDA tooling as well. And there are challenges with both aspects. And so I'm interested in hearing about, kind of what the methodology approach that they might use for AMS type of design, whether that be SerDes, a SRAM, a DDR4 controller, SRAM, other types of things. What's done in terms of functional verification, what type of circuits are used, some of the other major challenge areas. And then what goes in with that, I think is what Andrew you were getting at, was providing some different representative circuits for figurative merit type of test cases, right? And what type of benchmarks, you know, that could be collaboratively shared in that space. So is that kind of along the lines of what the question you were asking last week in the chat there?
Right. I mean, first of all, across Minnesota, Texas, and Michigan, there's at least 3 very strong analog layout synthesis or, directed idea projects. And I think there was a question of what happens after the end of idea in roughly summer of next year.
Yes, that's correct. Right.
That was one question. I forget all 3 of my questions, but that was one. And is there any sort of common backplane that they would plug into as part of going beyond July or summer of next year? And then I guess, what does CHIPS Alliance and its membership want to see as an outcome? And typically for analog, there's all these figures of merit, and it's notorious for human experts rejecting automation for a number of excellent reasons in their mind.
Right.
So
Right. Yes, I understand.
So that was the genesis of my questions, and I think I'll shut up and you should conduct your meeting. But the backdrop is, how can Open Road, I see Mehdi on the call, so that's great because he's obviously in both worlds. But aside from Mehdi, is there any particular type of Open Road project member that you'd like in these meetings? To what end? So maybe we can do this offline.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think I'll just comment. I think relative to participation of a particular Open Road member, perhaps maybe it's just an awareness thing. I don't know. And that could be based upon, bandwidth from the Open Road team's side, and then also particular interest from different participants. And not to pick on anyone, but Mirjana, maybe you could comment a bit what you'd like to see from possibly from Open Road, or in terms of some of the questions relative to the work group and how it moves forward.
Well, we are at SAL, we are literally at the beginning. We just taped out our first circuit to clean the backflow that we're using, and we're thinking now in what direction, not just thinking, but let's say making concrete steps to make it really functional. Let's put it like that. So
Okay.
for me it will be, for instance, interesting, like these 2 presentations that we have at regarding Magical, but also there is this Align, everything kind of funded with this idea, Electronic Resurgence Initiative group of projects. For me, it is interesting how basically the work that has been done, can be standardized, can be reused. So for me, that is something, basically to make, I wouldn't say we cannot standardize everything, but at least to try to develop in such a way that there is in future some convergence point. And that, that basically the work is, we could say even shared, because we all here because we kind of favor open source and would like to go into that direction. So that is what I would like to see. Maybe not a concrete answer, but as I said, more towards working together, but also towards some future plans, how we can at the end really cover all the bases, so that analog designers or layout analog designers, I wouldn't say be replaced, but at least their work will be ease up, especially in these deep submicrons multi-pattern technologies. Yeah, thanks.
Right. Yeah, I would.
If I could just add. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just.
Please go ahead, David.
If I could just add on top of that, I think, from my perspective, one of the biggest barriers to integration is tool setup. And I heard, is it Mirjana? Is that how you pronounce your name?
It's
wanna-
really refreshing to hear my name pronounced the only way in the US. It's
Sorry.
Miliana, because no problem. It was quite funny. In when I was in the US, I was waiting for some Mirjana to show up in a queue,
Yeah.
and that was me.
Yeah.
No problem. So
So Mirjana.
yeah,
Got it.
that's right.
Got it. So with a last name Wenzloff, I have an appreciation for making sure I pronounce people's names right. So I always ask.
Okay.
So yeah, I think just standardization, I think, is super important. I think that's a great point. And from just starting to say, from my perspective, I think the biggest barrier to adoption is this tool setup. And if there is a standardization on how we do that tool setup, or perhaps how we port to your process, because standing up the tools, in your environment is going to require configuring your tools and adapting to your process. And so how do we lower the barrier for doing that? Because that, I think, for any analog design, that tends to be at least one of the largest barriers. Before you can start, you got to stand up all these tools and do all this configuration and whatnot. And that's very different than, if I were to just go download somebody's Verilog for a SPI interface, which you can just open, understand pretty quickly by reading the code, and then integrate that module into other Verilog and run it through the flow. So, in other words, very low barrier. So I think that's the goal. That would be ideal if we could make analog design as easy as, let's say, downloading a module like a SPI block. But there's probably some middle ground, and it'd be great to standardize on what that looks like, what that is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, for us to test and to try other people's approaches, that is the biggest barrier. We all have limited amount of time, but it is actually a strategic move that we have to make in order to enable the reuse and, joint, or at least knowledge transfer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't know about others, but yeah. Thanks.
I think that part of the challenge too, right? So, and I'm sure that David and some of the other professors would agree that certainly trying to adopt any of the university applications to industrial settings does take time and resource. And so in part that comes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't know if everyone collect or heard the comments I had, but in terms of industry players having resource to help assign or work with universities to adopt the software to their particular environment, which could include process technology. Certainly, if we could come up with a standardized mechanism for making that happen, that would ease everyone's life. So I think that's a good thought. And so I see that we have Thomas Brantner from Infineon and Martin Luker-Boden from Western Digital here. So
yes,
I'm just curious.
Sorry for the delay. Yeah,
it's okay. No need for apologies.
And I can confirm also Mirjana's and Dave's statements that this you may call it standardization, or at least that the different solutions that are by origin academic, and of course different sources, that they are somewhat interoperable, or so that we also from a company point of view, we don't expect that we simply download it from GitHub and then everything is running on our environment. This we don't expect. You're not EDA vendors, but what would be great that we could come to a setup or a standardization sort of, where we could, for instance, take one part from, I don't know, from FASOC and another part from Magical and so on, based on our needs, that we don't need to take the complete Magical solution, for instance.
So you would like what's called a toolkit approach, then? Is that a fair way to put it? Or I can explain what I mean.
Or a modular approach. I mean, you can call it also standardization, that they are all based on the same, on a sort of framework, or a very simple one, hopefully. Because it's not academic interesting, but
yeah.
And of course, also linked to technology, that also that when we then switch from one technology to the other, that it's also then easy to set it up again and again. So these are the two aspects. From technology point of view, that it's easy to go from one technology to the other, and second, that we are also a little bit able to take not the complete solution like from Magical, but for instance, this is now ideal world, yeah, that we say, okay, they did a great job in the routing engine. We really would like to introduce that one into our design system, but for the, I don't know, the more the front end constraint entry, maybe you can then use something else. I mean, this is now a long-term vision, maybe more important, simpler technology stuff. And second is also that you have a little bit a modular approach to use parts of the different solutions.
I also think it will really help if, you know, all these solutions are a bit more documented, you know, especially, I know, I'm that's easier, that's more difficult than convergence point, but
Simple words, difficult to achieve.
yeah, exactly. No, but you know, for instance, if you have like one module, it will be good to know what exactly are you dealing as inputs and outputs, and then maybe it is easier to put a wrapper around it to kind of interact and communicate with the piece that you're having. Even that will help. And
Exactly.
not to say, for instance, if somebody who is developing that module actually provides parts or pieces to ease up, you know, at least, you know, some example to ease up development of the interface to people who are interested, you know, to use it within their system. I'm sorry,
So
I'm
let me-
just talking, you know, from the perspective of a small research organization that, you know, doesn't
But it's
have
also
that much
true for a
capacity.
bigger semiconductor company who would like to integrate parts of these solutions into their internal design system. Because for us, it's
So let
clear
me
that
add-
we will not copy and paste it. We need to integrate it, but then, yeah, it's better to have some documentation. Yeah.
Martin, you look like you want to. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Oh,
Martin.
I think, Thomas, it sounds like you're much farther along in adopting these. I mean, we've been looking at just even adopting digital tools for incorporating digital things like SUSOC, and we're just now looking at these analog approaches. But what we've found for incorporating these open source tools is that there is a lot of, first off, the documentation is key, and second off, the idiosyncrasies of the approach that the designer took into account have to be somehow laid out, and what sort of fundamental assumptions are there. Yeah, so I think a lot of it is going to be trial and error, and the documentation is going to be key, though, to help people understand what the motivations are.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask the three of you. I'll call you the industry representatives. So forgive me for that. But I guess my question is to the three of you is, in terms of, this being a community effort, if you will, is that something that you think that your companies would be willing to help in terms of working with academia to try to document some of the adaptation of the software to an industrial setting, right? Because I know it's not like, like when you pay, how many ever amounts of dollars to one of the major EDA players, right? So it's, the researchers, that's what they're really interested in, is working on hard problems. And, not that adopting software into an industrial setting is easy either. I've done that enough times myself, right? So I know both challenges, but in terms of trying to, establish a collaboration between the two to help, move these things forward, do you think that's something that would be possible? Or
well, I mean, if we try to, Western Digital does have a lot of interest in adopting open source technologies, generally speaking, for a variety of reasons. We have to document this adaptation regardless once we adopt these things. We could definitely, the one challenge would be is documenting it in such a way that it is not, it passes whatever screen you have for our internal processes, right? Which means that you also have to take the documentation and then sanitize it and make it more generic. Say, oh, well, let's just assume you're in a scenario like XYZ, and then scrub it so that the documentation becomes more generic. I think though that would be a small incremental effort. It's something that would have to be done, but it would be small compared to the thing of incorporating it into the general flow universally.
Yeah, I also share your
If I
share your
may,
point of view. It's true. And it's if I think about it, this is the only way how I can imagine that this whole would work, that we also contribute to this documentation, maybe also then merging your point of view, how you would document it with, let's say, for instance, our point of view, and then you converge to this kind of arbitrary documentation that you then cover different use cases, not only the view of one company. I think this is the only way then in such a. So I have to admit that still internally in my, let's say, with my manager, I still need to convince some of them that they cannot expect from an open source community simply that they do it when they do a good job, that you take that one and you integrate and everything is running. So there I have some internal effort still to convince them that we have to do things like that, yeah, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. It will not work.
Well, that's going to be like for me personally, being in an R&D group, I can adopt it for my own personal flow and my own personal prototypes, but then transitioning that to a product flow is going to be very challenging. And so there'll be these hurdles where, in some sense, for me, I'd be making it. I mean, it doesn't help anybody, but I'm just thinking out loud. For me, I'd be making a flow that would work inside our environment, but then it would still be an R&D document. I don't know. We could do that. The adoption. It's going to be a chicken and the egg problem for adoption. Until it happens smoothly, you're going to get just smaller groups adopting it, and once then you're going to have to then get other groups to commit to using it at the product level. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, would it make sense to bring in one of the tool vendors as a third party here to intermediate? Perhaps, I'll throw out Synopsys, for example. If Synopsys would help with the documentation for one, maybe, but just, the integration of some of these other tools with their tools. I'm not sure that they would do something like that, but, it's a thought.
I think that would be a hell of an uphill battle to get them, of all people, to support
Synopsys
like
in particular, you're saying?
Well, not necessarily, but Cadence is part of the IDEA program. Synopsys, I believe, is at least as a subcontractor, I think, to one of the groups. So, these tool vendors are part of this open source ERI, initiative. So there's an opportunity there.
We actually, I think, Michael, I think we may have had the same conversation in a digital group where we're trying to, point out that a lot of the things that we're making are complementary, not competitive. But I think that attitude, that opinion or sense that what we're making is competitive to the EDA tool vendors would have to be clearly delineated. Like, well, how does this benefit them, right? You have to make a benefit case.
Correct.
But I think that, one of the things that could be done in terms of documentation really is that very often when you're doing an open source project, and speaking as an industry representative, I hope it's not a derogatory term, you don't even know what you need to document from like an open source project's perspective until the potential users don't tell you about that. And there's very little discussion going on in terms of documentation specifically, because we're all engineers and few. So documentation is always the kind of worst part of any project. Even the best ones are typically under-documented. So I think that we could potentially kind of think of ways to facilitate, documenting, where we kind of clearly say, well, some things are impossible. Like, we can't tell an open source project, just go and document everything in minute detail according to Western Digital's requirements, and voila, that's unrealistic. Everyone knows that, right? So if we set specific non-goals, we can kind of, working back from there, realize, okay, but there are things you can do, and perhaps they don't get you the full way to the ideal situation, but they're a step in the right direction. And for us, for our open source projects, very often even the feedback like, hey guys, this specific part, like how do you do X, is undocumented, right? And then it becomes from like a general complaint about lack of documentation, which like everyone always, right? Anyone calls you up.
This
and
is a
says,
never-ending complaint.
your open source project is great, but it's under documented. Like, tell me something I
Well,
don't know, right?
but
But
that, I
like, if
guess, is
someone tells you your project is great, and I was trying to use this, and unfortunately, I can't seem to find information on that specific part. And if you could just like say a few words about that, that would really help. That's a much more focused and manageable request than just saying, do more documentation, which everyone kind of knows by now that they should be doing.
And
Is
I
it-
could
is-
imagine, so sorry.
Oh, just a question for Michael. Do you think it's helpful to just have, even if you don't have all the documentation out there, just all these different flows that are imagined with to-dos? I mean, I found that, when using certain tools, identifying that there's a flow that's out there that the creators have envisioned and created but not documented and just others to do there, helps me point to the person and say, like, could you help me flesh this out? I mean, it doesn't have to be complete to be useful.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what
absolutely.
but the advantage now in, let's say, in this Chips Alliance group here could be that, of course, I mean, now several companies could go to the real open source coders, yeah, and say, okay, what was your idea? And then maybe a private conversation, during a private conversation, you get the explanation, yeah, but then it's only for you. And maybe if we do that one in this group here, we could then let's say, remember, okay, we are a member of that group here. Maybe even if I now got first maybe a private answer by this guy, yeah, now inside this group, we should share that one and say, okay, now I have a documentation for that one. And this step by step then improves the oral documentation.
Can I?
So, hey,
Can I?
yeah, Mirana.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mirana.
So I'm just listening. Maybe I'm totally off the topic. It might happen. So, we are at the moment we are preparing our first generator to give back to BWRC, because we got some generators initially in the learning phase from them, and also to open source. The generator was first developed within SAL, but tape out. So basically, it was developed into 2 different design environments. First at SAL, and then we transferred the soft macro to EFAT. Then we fix it there. So
Infineon,
now, to Infineon, yeah. And then we're gonna bring it back to SAL, because there were like some changes that had different like spicing, and we're gonna kind of clean it and document at least the basic things, for back framework, which exact version it's used, for certain, let's say, submodules, etc. And it will be interesting to see how, whether it will be used or not. So what I'm saying, for me as an early adopter, it is important that I have one bone that I can hold tight, and maybe other things that are kind of differential, like, because I think for open source, the initial ramp up is difficult, and people quit there. So if we can at least make this initial point transition easier, get them, interested, I think if we make some documentation, if we make some good documentation, it should be at this entry point. So maybe I missed the point totally. I'm sorry.
No. It's also linked. I mean, you said documentation helps for let's say, for initial usage, yeah, for new users, and we said, Martin and I, we said that documentation also helps for experienced users. But then when we have the challenge to introduce it into our semiconductor company specific design flow, so in both cases, documentation seems to be a keyword. Yeah.
I have another thing to say here. Sorry, Rob.
Oh, go ahead.
I didn't meet anybody today, so you're the first big meeting.
That's all right.
Yeah. So regarding the knowledge exchange, for instance, within BAG, we have very small community, and we're using the Slack channel to kind of start a bit technical questions. So for sure, I think that beyond this first bone that we're giving, that is absolutely necessary to have some channel where we exchange, I'm not saying anything against analog work group, but we need to kind of empower and provide a meeting place for people who are interested. So maybe, I'm not sure, maybe Stack Exchange or something like that.
No, I think that's. Go ahead.
Go ahead. One thing I will say, the Slack channel sounds great. I was just about to message say I'd love to get my team on that Slack channel. But more importantly, there's also this thing about persistence. We can talk about these things in email or Slack, but really a system like a forum that's archived well, or a Jira system, is something where you can go through and just identify. You have a paper trail of the conversation and it's sorted cleanly by issue or thread. That actually is really useful when going back and collecting documentation, because the documentation user can just do a search for different tags, identify what problems people have had, and then add that to lists to add onto their document as they're building it up. So having something
That sounds
persistent.
great. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
Rob, as part of the Linux Foundation, I mean, have you created like these forums before that are well documented by thread, or because I don't know if Jira.
Short answer is no. So I've been with Linux Foundation for about 4 months now. So
okay.
No, that's okay. No. It's,
making assumptions based on your email address. I'm sorry.
It's always good to make assumptions, as particularly when someone's responsible for something like myself at this point. Let me just decline the call here. But I think relative to what Linux Foundation / CHIPS can provide, I think what you folks are asking, I think that's a reasonable request, right? Relative to what part of what this working group's goals are, right? Which is to understand capability or current research that's out there, and also shared challenges that different companies have, and then providing a way to archive, if you will, or provide communication vehicles for participants to benefit from. Right. So, I certainly am happy to look into or research, what, we can offer as part of this group. I mean, Michael's on the call here, so he's had quite a bit of experience with CHIPS Alliance so far. I don't know if he can comment on that too, but I understand what you're asking.
I absolutely can. So I've just pasted a link to the CHIPS Alliance Slack, and I've just created a channel for the analog work group as a starting point.
See, you're ahead of the curve.
But I don't know.
Because we do have a Slack, but I know you're asking about something more persistent, and that's of course a question that does pop up pretty often. It's all a matter of preferences and resources. I think preferences is one where we want to use something that people will be comfortable using. Resources is another. We want something that we won't be able to maintain as a relatively small group without kind of 10 IT support people somewhere that are helping us. And third, the third aspect I'd add to that is like preferably open source, or at least like kind of friendly towards open source, so that it's not some magical system that kind of nobody knows how to change and use. And we've been there. RefRisk-V, for example. I mean, that's kind of probably the longest running foundation experience that I have. It's not trivial.
Even something. Channels. I mean, GitHub issues work for this. In my experience.
Well, GitHub has discussions. I wanted to just say that GitHub actually has a special feature that's a new feature. It's called discussions, to separate from like issues, which are kind of issues. Like you're filing an issue, you're expecting a resolution, whereas discussions are meant for talking, and perhaps you never resolve the topic because you keep talking about it. And we could try that, right? Like I haven't used that feature much, so I won't lie that I'm an expert, but at least it's on GitHub, and we have a GitHub, and everyone has at least everyone that wants to contribute on the technical side should probably have a GitHub account if they don't yet. So discussions at least would have this benefit where everyone has a user, most likely. You don't have to ask people to create a new account somewhere, which always fails. But another idea, of course, is the mailing list. Like we do have mailing lists for the analog working group. Like for every working group, we have a alias that we can use, and membership, and all of this is kind of governed
Yeah.
through the Linux Foundation and Groups.io and so on. So that's like another way to do it, although I would say probably a little bit more old school than GitHub discussion, but either probably
Well,
works.
well, I actually, I think for the things that I'm envisioning and these little documentation hurdles where you're finding a problem, you know, if someone identifies a specific case that they're failing at, you open it, you really do open an issue. It's no longer part of a discussion. It shouldn't get lost in the discussion. It should get forked out into something that's a standalone thing. Someone has a challenge, and it's a thread all of its own that needs documenting, and
Yeah,
there's
I
some
mean-
discipline where someone needs to fork
To
that
be-
out and create it as a separate thread.
And by the way, like when you have those kind of things, it's a little bit different even. Like if you have a specific issue that someone's facing and you could document how to resolve that problem. If it's a wide enough problem, if it's very niche, then of course it should probably just stay as a issue that was closed. And if someone needs to find, just use. There's an issue that a lot of people encounter, right? And I think we're talking about these kind of things. We're not in the place where everything's nicely documented and just the niche cases blow up, right? It's more like almost nothing is documented. And even if you want to do something simple, like where do you start? So basically, as you said, I'll use your words here. It's about some kind of regime, some kind of approach and structure, right? Sorry, I didn't use your words exactly, but you meant
I was
like,
waiting. I
you
was
have to
like, what
have
words
some
is he
kind of
going to use?
some kind of an approach to this. And I think that what you can do and what I found useful in my team is like, we have a question from a customer regarding one of our open source projects, and my people, they want to reply with an email, and I tell them, write up a documentation item and send people a link instead, right? Like don't reply in an email, just kind of go and fill this item in the documentation, because it seems like we need that, and you'll describe this for this one person, and then that will get lost somewhere in email. GitHub Issues is better because it'll be online, but it won't be easy to find. So I would say that if you have this kind of rigor that we mark specific issues as interesting and worthy of documenting, for example, and you put a label on it, you know, saying, hey, that thing probably needs some documentation in the main project documentation, we could potentially process these kind of items in some way, help triage them, and kind of help, you know, and you have things like Google Season of Docs, or you have different kinds of or internships, you know, where you could just tell people, hey, here's a bunch of things that need documenting, but we already know what, right? Because the challenge is not just in doing the work, the challenge is in finding what work actually needs to be done, right? So even kind of marking specific things as worthwhile documenting would be already a step forward.
Right.
So I was
Which
going to
comes-
ask. No, again, I was going to ask folks here relative, you know, to what you're saying, Mike. I think in part, you know, aside from the documentation issue or challenge, is you know, particular issues or problems that, you know, a company may have, you know, when they're trying to use university software. I'd like to hear from you know, from the different professors who are participatory toward the call here today. You know, what's the best way for different industry partners to communicate with you about, you know, different challenges they may be having with the tool? And by challenges, I don't mean like simple usability issues. I'm referring more to, you know, let's say that a company's got some type of circuit or topology that they're trying to implement, and, you know, you didn't think of this or see this in your university work. You know, what's the best way for that communication to happen? And I realize that there's limitations on what can be communicated from a intellectual property perspective for a given company, right? So like, you know, one of the topics I had listed as possible interest for this group to cover would be, different methodology challenges that different companies are seeing in the analog space, but I realized that that may not be fully disclosable for whatever reason. So, but anyway, I'd just like to see what the best way is for. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dan from Berkeley here.
Yeah.
I think those are fine challenges on like layer, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5, and we're like on layer 0. I think what
Okay.
Dave said a few minutes ago is dead on, which is I think every piece of software you're going to hear about in this forum is just incredibly difficult to transfer from one institution to another.
Okay.
You can certainly say that for all of the Berkeley analog stuff. I mean, historically, the mechanism for get your company to run the Berkeley analog stuff is you hire a summer intern, and maybe by the end of the summer it runs. And so having the idea of, and I'm sure Mirjana can speak to their own experience and how much effort this has been. And so the idea that, there are a handful of things in the way, a lot of this is, I think I would turn this back to the folks from the academic community on, just how much emphasis do we want to place on the transferability of this stuff? I mean, even imagining, say, transferring these pieces of software between each other, I imagine we would find quite difficult. So the sort of forum for communicating this stuff is related, right? It is in some sense tied up in a lot of the legal agreements. A lot of these are built on proprietary tooling, whether from the major EDA vendors, and certainly have a lot of dependencies on the closed source and heavily NDA'd process technologies. So all of that is a hurdle that, we could, I don't know if this is a forum for talking about how to sort of cut through, but it's definitely one of the problems as far as we'll give, I'm sure any of the other groups can speak to this, but transferring their work to anyone else essentially requires replicating all of those agreements and the sort of technical setup that underpins them. So until there's, I think, some realistic mechanism for doing this stuff without like one of the experts on the piece of software working on it for an extended period of time, then, the sort of debates on the margins of how do we, get to the nth layer circuit, I think probably have to wait.
Okay.
This is Andrew. I
Yeah.
sent a link in chat in case of interest. I would say it's a matter of will and of being realistic and of recognizing innumerable but finite numbers of known blockers, such as IP rights, as you mentioned, or the Foundry PDK, and who has access to it, who will exercise their access in order to bring up what parts of the tool enablement for a particular node, and so on. So I think these are well understood, and we can, I guess, as a community, each sort of marvel at the difficulty, the challenge, or we can write down, existence proofs or known recipes, or at least the list of known hurdles that need to be overcome before even, having conversations like this, in some sense, right? I mean, there's the money hurdle as well. And there's the, reward or value or kind of value function that PhD students have, or postdocs or faculty. And until all of those are kind of aligned, I've seen 20 plus years of these conversations basically die. And I hope that this one will live, but, the IP umbrella of something like a Linux Foundation, the dollars, a Michigan student costs $100,000 a year, a UCSD student costs $100,000 a year. These are not small amounts of money, and that's just 20 hours a week officially, right? Because they have a life outside of their graduate student research assistantship. So being real about this was something that Open Road certainly had to grapple with, and our solution basically was to outsource to professional software engineers all the all of what makes OpenRoad a semi-nascent usable tool. And we're talking about that gap right here with BAG and Align and Magical and FASOC, I believe. So please understand the hurdle rate.
Rob, I just wanted to comment on your question on communication. So we do at least for our GitHub repo, we do track issues. So if any issues are filed there, we review those weekly. And then I just turned on the discussions feature for our FASOC. I didn't know about that, so it's on now. So we'll experiment with that. I'll have the students monitor. We're from a communication perspective, I think the way that's been successful in the past is it kind of starts with an email, usually to me or someone on the FASOC team, and then it goes from there. And it's been a handful of cases so far, but we've been successful at integrating the tools into other people's environments. But it's a hands-on thing with students, and we kind of manage that. It's manageable now because of the volume. I agree and love hearing about all the comments of we should get we should have a record of all of these communications so that we can, this can benefit other people in the future. The problem is the proprietary nature of everything, so some of the questions are about, proprietary commands or functions in the tool that we can't put publicly anywhere. So we've with the volume we've had today, we've been managing that just with the team. And if anyone on this call wants to reach out, feel free. My email's up on my website. Contact me. So we're very eager to integrate these tools into your flow. So happy to help however we can.
David, there's a scalability issue. I mean, sending your star PhD student on the project to Infineon for a summer or to Anthropro, et cetera, that's great. It's not a scaled solution, as has been pointed out.
Yeah.
It's one-off kind of thing. And there is the question of how do you reconcile, this tool has really been adopted by industry with the fact that, it's used in industry in production, so it needs support. It needs bug fixes, it needs hot fixes, and the students are gone. They don't, no student believes that they should work for $30,000 a year in salary to do what people get paid 5 to 10x that in Cadence to do. So how do we as a working group or community reconcile these tensions? I think that's kind of the point of the paper I linked to. And I feel like if there's no even plausible notion of a solution to this tension, then things are going to not look good, let's say 3 years from today. So that's my feeling. You may feel like the power of open source and community outweighs all of that, but
and that's the hope, right?
I would really second that. And I would also note that this actually kind of inverts the role of open source in a lot of the rest of the software community. Like, these projects are kind of harder to get going. They require, as Andrew put it, this sort of unscalable, you need one of the PhD student authors to essentially stand it up. Whereas, one of the real boons of the general open source community and software is just grab this stuff and go. And we essentially have the opposite, much harder story to provide industry partners. And I think it is a sort of definitional question of, how much of this work, how much of putting into, this is something that people can pick up without, dozens or hundreds of K worth of human capital invested to use. Like, how much of that legwork do we want to build into these academic projects? And it's great to have that enthusiasm to say, we'll line up the students. But I think Andrew's got a good point in that that seems to have to run dry, doesn't it?
Well, I can speak for what we're doing for FASOC now. So it doesn't require an intern we're working with a government agency right now to stand that up remotely, using their engineers, just guiding them through the process. And we'll hopefully know more by end of August. That's their target, to have everything stood up and a test chip, including FASOC tools. But it's a process. I agree. It's not. I mean, I said at the top that this model is not scalable, but it's a starting point. It starts getting adoption, and then if you have people who start contributing to the tool, ideally, it can start growing organically, and have a life of itself. I guess that's the hope. But yeah, but these are the challenges, right? These are the challenges we're facing. No good answer.
I think that, the comparison to software these days is a difficult one because, of course, we're in a far worse situation. But I think it's better to compare, what's going on in hardware now to the early days of open source software, where, I mean, of course, the details will be different. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one comparison, but it's a much more apples to apples. If you say, well, we're in the, kind of Linus Torvalds posts to the mailing list times of software. And then you realize you probably also needed Linus Torvalds to kind of boot the first versions of Linux, because it didn't magically fall down from the sky. What happened in open source software, it was just a matter of momentum, and it took years and years for it to change. When we started at Micro in 2009, on the premise of let's use open source, let's use Linux in embedded and so on, we were like aliens. People are looking at us as if we're kind of dumb to be assuming that Linux is the answer to everything, for embedded systems specifically. And of course that changed rapidly because of smartphones, because of like server room and all the other things that happened. But as late as 2009, I don't mean for the general purpose, for the but more like for cars. Like, automotive grade Linux is a fairly new thing, right? Or for like, how could you put, Linux in space? That was almost a blasphemy to say. And of course, right now, they're flying Snapdragon CPUs in the drone that's flying on Mars, right? So in general, this is just a story that unfolds and it takes a long time. And I don't think it's an if, it is going to happen, but it's a matter of when, and hopefully it doesn't take 20 years. And we can learn some of the lessons from software, but we should be learning from the early lessons, from like, what did open source software do to scale, rather than what does open source software do today, now that they have hundreds of thousands of developers already doing open source software.
Yeah,
right? Because we're not going to be able to replicate that momentum.
Well, and then the early days, all of that is well taken. I mean, the early days, there were a lot of people serving as consultants for initial adoption. And we still have enterprise support companies now. So, I mean, there's going to have to be some model that comes out of this, and it is going to grow slowly.
I mean, I think there is, as Michael knows, with Antmicro, they are one of the early ones in this space. I was chatting with a person yesterday who has a small company in the UK that is interested in doing the same type of thing. So I think it's a question, and I think Andrew's points are well taken relative to the scalability and challenges. And people who can delve into any particular piece of code, like a detailed router, or say a statistical timing analyzer, as two examples that I'm somewhat knowledgeable with, right? That they just don't grow on trees. That doesn't mean that a community can't grow up around that and learn. There's a lot of smart and talented people around, but you kind of need something to start with and have some degree of expertise. And so I think there is business potential for some companies like Antmicro as an example, but there are a few others out there that could help, start this or bridge this gap. But we're not completely there yet, right? And I think participation from some industry players like Western Digital or Infineon or Silicon Austria Labs, may be able to help out somewhat and get that going, but it's going to take some time.
Rob, just to kind of out of curiosity, who is the largest contributor to Linux today? Just, as like a case study or an example.
You know, I don't honestly know the answer to that question. You mean in terms of like lines of code you're asking about?
Yeah, who writes most of the code for Linux today?
I don't know. I'll see if I can find out. I have some statistics for a presentation that I'm going to give at the end of the year, but I don't have
Okay.
that specific detail. But I'll find
Huawei
out.
and
GNU.
Intel.
It's Intel,
are
right?
the-
Well, for the Linux kernel, but
Huawei
also
and Huawei.
for the whole GNU tool chain. I mean, it's a whole ecosystem there, right?
Okay, well, right, whole ecosystem, but there's probably someone who is contributing the most. And I'm curious, you know, I guess I would have thought it was Red Hat.
I read
They're
the statistics recently.
one
I
of
think
the
it's not
top
Red Hat, but
contributors.
Intel is. I think Intel is contributing a lot, and
Okay.
Red Hat is also there, but not the biggest one. I remember I read Intel. Okay, Intel
and
Huawei. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
you know, Red Hat has a vested interest because they make money on Linux. Intel, I can see as a vested interest because Linux has to run well on their processors.
And with their ecosystem, yeah.
Yeah. Huawei is probably similar. So, you know, there's a stakeholder. My point, there's a stakeholder who benefits financially from contributions to the Linux operating system. So who's the stakeholder that would benefit financially from contributions to a open source mixed signal design tool? Who's that person? And that person can help carry those tools forward because they will have the financial resources to do it.
But it will demand a huge leap of faith, you know, in this situation when none of these options are kind of compatible. I don't see, you know, you cannot compare. So this is like, let's say, Linux tip
At the very, very
of the
beginning.
wave. Yeah, and exactly. So we cannot compare now the tip of the wave with, you know, just the beginning of, I don't know, tsunami. So like I would just like to comment on the like the general story about, you know, scalability and the student problems. My personal opinion is that some of these problems can be solved with a good initial documentation, as I said, with a bone that everybody can hang and start from, because you cannot expect students to stay forever. I mean, there are some students, especially from Berkeley RISC-V, let's say, involved into that activity that were PhD students for 10 years. But we cannot expect that. But, you know, we need to provide continuity and solid ground for future work. Even if idea is finished, you know, you just give the kids enough meat to make something out of it. So I don't see any other solution, but networking definitely and working together, because, you know, I mean, Finns, they have very long winters, and I don't know whether there will be another, let's say, a person like that to carry out the burden. I you know, so what I'm saying, we need to split and basically divide and conquer, but in another sense. So that is my personal opinion. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I would really second Mariana's initial sentiment there, that there is this leap of faith required, and there is the analogy to corporate contributions to Linux requires this bootstrapping phase in which Linux initially becomes valuable to them, which, you know, how you get through that is more of the active question here.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it's a combination typically of leaps of faith on behalf of the people that can afford it, and hence we need, you know, the Western Digitals and the Googles and hopefully the Infineons and the you know, Intels of the world. By the way, we totally get Intel to participate here. They've expressed an interest, but we've been stupid enough not to follow up. So just fix that during call.
I
But,
thought, yeah,
in
no,
general-
I thought David Kellett said he was going to be here, but I guess he couldn't make it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna put David.
okay, but the Align guys, I mean, Steve.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Other person.
I need
I
to
fixed
follow
it.
up with that.
So
So
basically,
if Sorry, Michael, if I can just add one thing that could be maybe shed a bit of light. So for instance, we having this cooperative project with Infineon. They're doing like bag, let's say, development in their own environment, and definitely they cannot share that. On the other hand, we're a research organization, and what we're doing at the moment, we're claiming back to Flow, and we're gonna, if if everything goes well, maybe even like kind of contribute with our version. And I think these cooperations, this kind of like combos and synergies are super important, because obviously there is a lot of knowledge on the industry side, but they cannot share it. And these good
It's hard for us
practices.
to share, because if we
Yeah,
put the
I
sticker
know.
Infineon on it and try to, then there are many other guys, maybe even legal guys, and say, it's not maybe our main interest to do so. But if we can collaborate, for instance, with SAL, and they then do the open source job, this
Open
is
source
our current way of thinking
strategy,
to some
exactly.
extent, yeah.
And that's
At least
how
for
we
BAG, not for other
typically-
parts.
Yeah, and that's how we typically work as Ant Micro, for example. We do work for others that they potentially couldn't do themselves internally, because there would be this legal barrier if they put their own sticker on it. But it's fine if we do it, right? Because we're not them.
No, it's funny, but that's life, unfortunately. Let's say it's fun or strange from an engineering point of view, but.
Martin, you want to say something?
Nothing relevant. Nothing essential.
No, I think Thomas, I think that's a good point that you bring up relative to say like Infineon or other companies, that they cannot necessarily share experience or work, whereas if they go through say like Silicon Austria Lab, or say through Ant Micro or other partners, that then it may be just okay. But I can appreciate that anything that you say yourself as part of Infineon, so to speak, would be a challenge. So we are at the hour here. Is there any other things folks want to cover today, or thoughts on the next meeting topics? Should I look to get to see if I can have the Align folks come and present?
At least from my point of view, yes, because that's for us, let's say, it's the last missing part, yeah, because we already have FASOC, Magical, and then a BAG, yeah, okay, but they are at least in the list, not a presentation yet, but they are in part of that working group already. And Align is, let's say, from our point of view, still the only big player there that is still missing, isn't it?
Yeah, I have my list.
Are they part of Analog Group? Yeah.
No,
or...
not yet.
No, not yet.
So in the presentation outlook, what I have listed here is I have BAG/Chipyard. Professor Nikolic did give a presentation on Chipyard at a CHIPS Alliance seminar back in March, but we certainly could ask for a presentation on BAG and/or Chipyard. I have Align listed here, and then I don't know if folks wanted to hear about Open Road from Professor Kong and his team, but that's what I had listed for presentation outlook from researchers.
It will be great, to get just different perspectives. There is always a piece of information that we might not use maybe instantly, but later on.
Okay.
And I can tell you, it's already helpful for us internally, because we started with BAG. I mean, even this decision was more than 1 year back and so on at Infineon internal. But now with maybe a few of your videos, now I could now already start, I'd say internally also convince some managers or decision makers, say, okay, first we now start with BAG, but we should already start mentally thinking of integrating other solutions stepwise, then also into our design system. And so it's already helpful, but Europe, anyway, you ask for another conversation, and there we could talk about that one in more detail, and let's say further steps, let's say from our membership, I suppose, and so on. Yeah, you asked me for a separate conversation. We can do that.
Oh yeah, just for a one-on-one, right?
Yeah.
So
quick comment on Align.
Yeah.
We're now at Michigan. We're now using Align to generate 5 different auxiliary cells for FASOC. So that's the only part that's manual for us is the standard cell or the auxiliary cell itself, the layout of the aux cell, and then we slurp that into APR and tools to do the placement and routing. But we've now been able to use Align to generate 5 different aux cells in GF12. So yeah, I think it'd be great to, first of all, get them in this group as part of the discussion, but also have them present.
Okay, I will follow up on that. All right, let's see. I know we're out of time here. Yeah, the other, just the other thought here, just wow, is in terms of trying to see if I could get some foundry engagement. You know, I did have a conversation with TSMC a couple weeks back. You know, I know Cliff Ho from my work at Oracle, and I'd met with one of his folks to talk about possible interest in Chips Alliance. So they're definitely interested in what we're trying to do in the open source arena. I think their concern is just primarily that they don't want to alienate any of their industrial partners, which, you know, I can understand that argument. So certainly stay in touch. And I know Michael's been having conversations with Global Foundries about different possible collaboration efforts. And so I'm going to follow up with Mark Ireland from that group too, to see if I could get them as part of this. I know one of the things I talked with Global Foundries, right, is about having a way to obfuscate some of the PDKs. And I know there's different thoughts about, you know, wanting to have a fully open PDK, such as the Skywater 130, right? And there's a lot of benefit from that. And I even learned in a conversation yesterday that a person in the open source community actually fixed a def creator as part of that, which I thought was rather interesting. So anyway, but interesting from the perspective that I wouldn't think that someone would necessarily just go do that, but lo and behold, they actually do. So I think there's opportunity there. You know, whether or not an obfuscated type of PDK would be of useful interest to the community, I don't know. Effectively, the way the process works, my understanding is that the creator has a mutual NDA sign-off process with a fab, you know, to help protect IP. But you know, I'll just put that out there. So anyway, we are out of time. So I thank everyone for attending today and also for staying on a bit longer too. And I will share the link to the notes that I've taken during the conversation today. So I appreciate everyone's time and thoughts. So anything else before we go? All right. Well, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. Have a lovely
Bye.
day.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, you guys too. Bye now.